The music pulsed through the San Francisco night, a relentless beat that shook the pavement and drowned out the screams in Mateo's head. He stood outside the club, neon lights painting his leather jacket in shades of electric blue, his breath visible in the chilly air. He wasn't here for love and never was, but the stranger's eyes across the bar had held him captive, promising something he couldn't name. Mateo Rivera was no stranger to fleeting connections. At 29, he'd built a life on the edges of intimacy, a tattoo artist who wore his scars like art and his heart like armor. Raised in the Mission District, he'd learned early that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. His childhood was a blur of foster homes, whispered slurs, and fists that taught him to keep his queerness quiet. Now, he thrived in the chaos of the city's nightlife, where hookups were simple, expectations low, and goodbyes easy. But tonight, something felt different. The man across the bar was named Julian Harper, though Mateo didn't know it yet. Julian was 26, an art student with a sketchbook always tucked under his arm, his soft brown curls catching the light. He'd come to the club with friends, dragged along despite his protests, his heart still bruised from a breakup 6 months prior. Julian didn't do hookup. She believed in love, the kind that lasted, the kind his parents still shared after 30 years. But when his eyes met Mateo's, something reckless stirred. Mateo's gaze was a storm, all intensity and shadow, and Julian felt himself pulled under. They didn't speak at first. Mateo crossed the crowded dance floor, weaving through bodies slick with sweat, until he stood close enough to feel Julian's warmth. Dance. Mateo's voice was low, rough, like he'd smoked too many cigarettes or shouted too many truths. Julian nodded, his throat tight, and they moved together, the music a tether between them. Their bodies found a rhythm, hips brushing, hands grazing, each touch a question neither dared to answer. By midnight, they were in Mateo's apartment, a cramped studio above a taqueria, walls covered in sketches and half-finished canvases. Clothes hit the floor before words could catch up. It was fast, desperate, a collision of need and release. Mateo expected Julian to leave after, like they always did. But Julian stayed, curled against him, his breath steady in the dark. "What's your name?" Julian whispered, his voice soft but curious. "Mateo," he replied, surprised at how easily it slipped out. "You?" "Julian." A pause, then a laugh. "This isn't what I do. You know." Mateo smirked, propping himself on an elbow. "What?" "Sleep with strangers." "Trust strangers," Julian corrected, his eyes searching Mateo's. There was a vulnerability there, a crack in the armor Mateo hadn't expected. He didn't know how to respond, so he kissed Julian instead, slow and deliberate, like he could silence the questions rising in his chest. Morning came too soon. Julian left with a shy smile and a promise to text. But Mateo didn't believe in promises. He tossed Julian's number into a drawer, expecting it to stay there. Another fleeting night to forget. But Julian texted later that day. A simple "Hey, wanna grab coffee?" Mateo stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the reply button. He didn't do coffee. He didn't do dates. But something about Julian's earnestness, the memory of his laughter, made Mateo type back, "Sure. Why not?" They met at a cafe in the Castro, where rainbow flags lined the streets and drag queens sipped lattes on the sidewalk. Julian brought his sketchbook, flipping through pages of vibrant drawing cityscapes. Portraits. A sketch of a man who looked suspiciously like Mateo. "You're good," Mateo said, meaning it. Julian blushed, his fingers nervous on the pages. "I see things," Julian said. "People. Moments. I try to capture them before they're gone." Mateo leaned back, his guard still up. "And what do you see in me?" Julian's eyes softened. "Someone who's afraid to be seen." The words hit harder than Mateo expected. like a punch he hadn't braced for. He changed the subject. But Julian's insight lingered, a splinter under his skin. They talked for hours about art, music, the city they both loved but saw through different lenses. Julian spoke of his family, his cousin Ellie who was getting married in a month, how he was designing her wedding invitations. Mateo offered little, only hints of his past. But Julian listened like every word mattered. By their third coffee date, Mateo was breaking his own rules. He let Julian stay over again. Let him leave a toothbrush in the bathroom. Let him fill the silence with stories of his life in Oakland, his dreams of opening an art gallery. Mateo didn't know how to name the warmth spreading in his chest, but he knew it scared him. He'd spent years keeping people at arm's length, but Julian was slipping through the cracks. One night, as they lay tangled in sheets, Julian traced the tattoos on Mateo's arm, a phoenix rising from flames, a reminder of surviving his past. "What's the story here?" Julian asked. Mateo hesitated, then spoke. "Got it when I was 18, after I left my last foster home. They didn't take kindly to me being out." Julian's fingers stilled, his expression soft but fierce. "You deserved better." Mateo shrugged, but the words settled deep. No one had ever said that to him before. He pulled Julian closer, kissing him to stop the ache in his throat. For the first time, Mateo wondered if he could be more than a hookup, if he could be someone. But doubt lingered. Julian was light, hope, everything Mateo wasn't. What if this was just a phase for him, a fling before he returned to his tidy life? Mateo pushed the thought down, but it gnawed at him, a reminder of every time he'd let himself hope and been burned. A week later, Julian invited Mateo to a street festival in the Mission, a celebration of art and culture. Mateo hesitated, didn't do crowds, didn't do public, but Julian's excitement was infectious. They wandered through stalls, Julian sketching quick portraits of strangers, Mateo watching him with a mix of awe and unease. When a vendor mistook them for a couple, Julian didn't correct her, and Mateo didn't either. The word hung between them, unspoken but heavy. As the festival wound down, Julian pulled Mateo into a quiet alley, his eyes bright. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know this isn't your thing." Mateo's heart thudded. "You're my thing," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Julian's smile was radiant, and he kissed Mateo right there, under a string of fairy lights, the world fading to just the two of them. For a moment, Mateo let himself believe this could last. But the universe had other plans. Julian's phone buzzed, a reminder about his cousin's wedding rehearsal. "You should come," Julian said impulsively. "Meet my family. It'll be fun." Mateo froze. Family wasn't his territory. Families judged, rejected, broke you. But Julian's hope was impossible to refuse. "Maybe," Mateo said, his voice tight. As they parted ways that night, Mateo couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something bigger than himself, something he wasn't ready for. Julian's world was opening to him, but so were the risks. And deep down, Mateo knew nothing this good ever came without a cost. Julian's family home in Oakland was a world away from Mateo's gritty studio. The house was warm, sprawling, filled with photos of smiling faces and shelves heavy with books. Mateo stood in the doorway, his leather jacket out of place among the soft pastels and laughter spilling from the living room. Julian's hand brushed his, a quiet anchor, but Mateo's pulse raced. He hadn't been in a family home since he was a kid, and the memories weren't kind. "Relax," Julian whispered, squeezing his hand. "They're gonna love you." Mateo doubted that. He wasn't the guy you brought home to meet the parents. But Julian's optimism was a force of nature, pulling him into the chaos of the Harper family. Julian's mom, Clara, greeted him with a hug that caught him off guard, her warmth disarming. His dad, Marcus, offered a firm handshake and a joke about Mateo's tattoos. Not unkindly. But it was Ellie, Julian's cousin, who stole the room's attention. She was a whirlwind of energy, her engagement ring glinting as she talked about her wedding plans. Her fiancé still a mystery Mateo hadn't met. Ellie pulled Julian aside to discuss the wedding invitations, leaving Mateo with Clara, who asked about his art. He mumbled something about tattoos, expecting judgment, but she listened, genuinely curious. "You must see a lot of stories in your work," she said, her eyes kind. Mateo nodded, unsure how to handle someone seeing him without pity or prejudice. Dinner was loud, messy, full of overlapping voices and inside jokes. Mateo stayed quiet, watching Julian laugh with his family, his ease a stark contrast to Mateo's tension. He wanted to belong here, but the weight of his past foster homes, rejection, the slurs that still echoed in his head made it hard to breathe. When Julian's hand found his under the table, Mateo held on like it was a lifeline. After dinner, Julian dragged him to the backyard, where string lights cast a soft glow over a garden bursting with roses. "You okay?" Julian asked, his voice gentle. Mateo shrugged, his walls creeping back up. "This isn't my world, Julian. Families like yours, they don't get guys like me." Julian stepped closer, his eyes fierce. "They don't have to get you. I do." The words hit Mateo like a tidal wave, stirring something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, raw and terrifying. He kissed Julian under the stars, desperate to hold onto this feeling. But doubt lingered. What if Julian's family saw through him? What if Julian did? The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments. Julian spent more nights at Mateo's, filling the studio with sketches and laughter. They cooked tacos together, danced to old records, argued about art styles, Julian's vibrant realism versus Mateo's stark, inked lines. Each moment chipped away at Mateo's defenses, but he couldn't shake the fear that this was temporary, that Julian would wake up and see him for what he was, a man too broken for love. One evening, Julian showed Mateo the wedding invitations he'd designed for Ellie. They were stunning, all elegant lines and soft colors, with a sketch of two hands intertwined. "This is them," Julian said, his voice warm. "Ellie and her fiancé, Liam. They're so in love it's almost gross." Mateo laughed, but something twisted in his gut. Love like that felt like a fairy tale, something for other people. "You believe in that stuff. Forever and all that." Julian's eyes met his, steady and sure. "I believe in fighting for what matters." Mateo wanted to believe him, but his past whispered otherwise. He'd fought before for acceptance, for survival, and lost. Still, he let Julian pull him into plans for the wedding, agreeing to attend as his +1. It felt like stepping onto a tightrope without a net. The rehearsal dinner was at a rooftop venue overlooking the bay, the city lights glittering like a promise. Mateo wore a borrowed blazer, feeling like an imposter among the polished guests. Julian, in a tailored suit, looked effortless, his smile lighting up the room. He introduced Mateo to everyone, his pride evident. But Mateo couldn't shake the stares, the subtle questions in people's eyes. Who is this guy with the tattoos and the guarded smile? Then he saw the groom. Liam stepped into the room, tall and polished, his blonde hair catching the light. Mateo's breath caught, not because of Liam's looks, but because of the memory that slammed into him. A bar in the Mission, 6 months ago. A night of too many drinks. A stranger's hotel room. A hookup he'd barely remembered until now. Liam's face, flushed and unguarded, flashed in his mind. It was him. The man who'd left without a word, just like Mateo always did. Panic clawed at Mateo's chest. He excused himself, slipping onto the balcony, the cold air a shock against his skin. Julian followed. Concern etched on his face. What's wrong? Mateo's throat tightened. I know him. Liam. We hooked up. Once. Before you. Julian's face froze. His eyes searching Mateo's. What? It was nothing, Mateo said quickly, his voice raw. Just a night. I didn't know he was. I didn't know. Julian's jaw clenched, but he didn't pull away. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't remember until now, Mateo said, hating how weak it sounded. It meant nothing. Julian. You mean everything. Julian looked away, his hands gripping the railing. The silence was deafening, heavier than the city's hum below. I need to think, he said finally, his voice tight. He walked back inside, leaving Mateo alone with the weight of his past crashing down. Mateo stood there, staring at the skyline, his mind racing. He'd known this would happen new, he'd ruined something good. Liam was Ellie's fiancé, Julian's cousin's future husband. And now, Mateo's careless night threatened to unravel everything. He wanted to run, to disappear like he always did. But the thought of losing Julian stopped him cold. For the first time, he wanted to stay, to fight, even if it meant facing the mess he'd made. The rooftop was a cage of glass and steel, trapping Mateo's thoughts as he watched Julian disappear into the crowd. The laughter and clinking glasses felt like mockery, each sound a reminder of how out of place he was. He'd always known he didn't belong in Julian's world, but the truth of it stung sharper now, cutting through the fragile hope he'd let himself build. Mateo stayed on the balcony, the cold biting his knuckles as he gripped the railing. He replayed that night with Liam blurry, meaningless, just another face in a string of forgettable encounters. He hadn't even known Liam's name then, hadn't cared to ask. But now, that careless moment was a grenade, threatening to blow up everything he'd found with Julian. He wanted to tell himself it didn't matter, that Julian would understand. But the look on Julian's face hurt. Betrayal said otherwise. Inside, Julian stood near the bar, his smile forced as he nodded at something Ellie said. His eyes kept darting to the balcony, torn between anger and worry. He'd trusted Mateo, let him in despite his own fears. And now this. Liam, of all people. The man who'd swept Ellie off her feet, who'd seemed so perfect, so safe. Julian's stomach churned at the thought of them together, even if it was before they'd met. It wasn't just jealousy, it was the fear that Mateo's past would always haunt them, that maybe he'd misjudged the man he was falling for. Ellie noticed his distraction, nudging him. You okay, Jules? Where's your guy? Julian forced a laugh. Just getting some air. It's fine. But it wasn't. He excused himself and headed back to the balcony, his heart pounding. Mateo was still there, his silhouette stark against the city lights, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying the weight of the world. Julian wanted to be angry, to demand answers, but the sight of Mateo so vulnerable, so unlike the confident man he'd met, softened his resolve. Talk to me, Julian said, his voice quieter now. What happened with Liam? Mateo turned, his eyes shadowed. It was one night. Julian. 6 months ago. At some dive bar. I was drunk. He was there. And it just happened. I didn't even know his name until tonight. Julian crossed his arms, the cold seeping through his suit. And you didn't think to mention it. Not even when you knew I was designing their invitations. I didn't remember, Mateo said, his voice breaking. I don't keep track of every hookup. Okay. That's not who I am with you. Julian's chest tightened. He wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at him. Who are you with me, Mateo? Because I thought I knew. But now. Mateo stepped closer, his hands clenched like he was fighting to stay grounded. I'm the guy who's terrified of losing you. The guy who's never had someone like you, someone who sees me. Who makes me want to be better. I didn't know Liam was your cousin's fiancé. I swear. Julian. It meant nothing. Julian looked away, the city blurring through unshed tears. It's not just about Liam. It's about trust. I let you in. Mateo. I told you things I don't tell anyone. And now I'm wondering if I made a mistake. The words cut deeper than Mateo expected, sharper than any rejection he'd faced. He wanted to reach for Julian, to pull him close and erase the distance between them. But he stayed still, afraid one wrong move would break them for good. You didn't, he said softly. I'm not perfect, Julian. My past is messy, and I've got scars I can't hide. But I'm here, and I'm trying. For you. Julian's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. He didn't know what to believe, but he knew he didn't want to lose Mateo, not yet. I need time, he said finally. It's a lot. Mateo nodded, his throat tight. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. But as Julian walked away, Mateo wasn't sure if he believed his own words. He'd never fought for anyone before, never thought he was worth fighting for. But Julian had changed that. And now, with everything on the line, Mateo felt the weight of his own choices pressing down. The next few days were a blur of silence. Julian didn't text, didn't call, and Mateo didn't push. He threw himself into his work, inking designs onto clients' skin, each stroke a distraction from the ache in his chest. He sketched late into the night, filling pages with Julian's face's eyes, his smile, the way he looked when he thought no one was watching. Each drawing was a plea, a way to hold on to something he feared he'd lost. Meanwhile, Julian wrestled with his own doubts. He sat in his Oakland apartment, surrounded by half-finished sketches, unable to focus. He kept replaying Mateo's words, the raw honesty in his voice. He wanted to believe it was a mistake, that Mateo's past didn't define him. But the image of Liam, his cousin's perfect groom, kept intruding. He didn't know how to face Ellie, how to carry this secret without it tearing him apart. One evening, Julian showed up at Mateo's studio unannounced. Mateo was mid-session, his tattoo gun humming as he worked on a client's arm. He froze when he saw Julian, his heart lurching. Give me a sec, he told the client, stepping outside. Julian looked tired, his eyes rimmed with shadows. I talked to Liam, he said without preamble. He remembers you. Said it was a one-time thing. Like you said. He didn't even know your name. Mateo's stomach twisted. Did you tell him about us? No, Julian said, his voice low. I didn't know what to say. Ellie doesn't know. And I don't want to ruin her wedding. Mateo nodded, relief mixing with guilt. I'm sorry, Julian. I never meant to put you in this position. Julian sighed, running a hand through his curls. I know. I need to know you're all in. No secrets. No running. Can you do that? Mateo met his gaze, his heart pounding. I'm trying. I want to be that guy for you. But I'm scared, too. I've never done this, never let someone in like this. Julian's expression softened, and he stepped closer, his hand brushing Mateo's. Then we're both scared. But I don't want to walk away. They stood there, the street buzzing around them, the air thick with possibility. Mateo wanted to kiss him, to promise everything, but he settled for a nod. Okay, let's figure this out together. Julian smiled, small but real, and for the first time in days, Mateo felt like he could breathe. But the wedding loomed, a ticking clock. Liam's presence was a shadow they couldn't ignore, and Mateo knew the hardest part was still ahead. The wedding venue was a dreamscape, a vineyard in Napa Valley draped in golden sunlight and blooming vines. Mateo stood at the edge of the ceremony space, his borrowed suit stiff against his skin, feeling like an intruder in this picture-perfect world. Julian was beside him, his hand a quiet reassurance. But the sight of Liam at the altar, adjusting his cufflinks, sent a jolt through Mateo's chest. Today was about Ellie and Liam. But for Mateo, it was a test one he wasn't sure he'd pass. The past week had been fragile but hopeful. Julian had started texting again, small messages that grew into late-night calls. They'd met for coffee, walked the Embarcadero, talked about everything except Liam. Mateo had opened up more, sharing stories of his foster care days, the art that saved him, the fear that still woke him at night. Julian listened, his presence a balm to wounds Mateo hadn't realized still bled. But the wedding was a looming shadow, a reminder of the secret they carried. Now, as guests filled the rows of white chairs, Mateo scanned the crowd. Julian's family was there, warm and welcoming, oblivious to the tension coiled in his chest. Ellie floated through the venue, radiant in a flowing dress, her laughter infectious. Mateo wanted to feel happy for her, but Liam's presence was a splinter he couldn't ignore. Julian squeezed his hand. "You're doing great," he whispered, his smile soft but strained. He'd been wrestling with his own guilt, torn between protecting Ellie and trusting Mateo. He decided not to tell her about Liam's past, not now, not days before her wedding, but the weight of that choice pressed on him. The ceremony began, music swelling as Ellie walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on Liam. Mateo watched, his throat tight, as Liam's face softened with love. Whatever had happened between them was gone, buried in a night neither had claimed. But when Liam's gaze flickered to the crowd and met Mateo's, just for a second, Mateo saw recognition brief, sharp, then gone. Liam looked away, his smile unwavering, but Mateo's heart pounded. Did Liam know about him and Julian? Would he say something? Julian's hand tightened on his, grounding him. "It's okay," he murmured, as if reading Mateo's thoughts. "We're okay." The vows were beautiful, full of promises Mateo wanted to believe in. Ellie's voice trembled with emotion, Liam's steady and sure. Mateo glanced at Julian, whose eyes were bright with tears, not for the secret they shared, but for his cousin's joy. Mateo envied that, the ability to feel so deeply without fear. He wanted to be that open, that brave, but his past kept him guarded. After the ceremony, the reception spilled onto a terrace overlooking the vineyard, fairy lights twinkling against the dusk. Julian pulled Mateo onto the dance floor, his laughter easing the knot in Mateo's chest. They swayed to a slow song, Julian's head resting against Mateo's shoulder. "I'm glad you're here," Julian said, his voice barely audible over the music. "Me too," Mateo replied, meaning it. For the first time, he felt like he could belong somewhere, with someone. But the moment was fleeting. Liam approached, Ellie at his side, her smile wide as she introduced her new husband. "Mateo, right?" Liam said, his tone polite but guarded. His eyes held Mateo's for a beat too long, a silent acknowledgement of their shared past. Mateo nodded, his jaw tight, and Julian's hand tensed in his. "Congrats," Mateo managed, his voice steady despite the storm inside. Ellie beamed, oblivious, and pulled Liam away to greet other guests. Julian let out a breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "He knows," Mateo said quietly, once they were alone again. Julian nodded, his expression heavy. "Yeah, but he won't say anything. Not today." Mateo wanted to believe him, but the encounter left him shaken. He excused himself to get some air, stepping onto a quiet corner of the terrace. The vineyard stretched out before him, endless rows of green under a fading sky. He thought of Julian, of the trust they were rebuilding, and wondered if it was enough to carry them through this. Julian found him a few minutes later, his tie loosened, his eyes searching. "You're spiraling," he said, not a question, Mateo laughed, bitter and soft. Can you blame me? I'm the guy who hooked up with the groom. Julian. I don't belong at weddings like this. Julian stepped closer, his voice firm. You belong with me. That's what matters. Mateo looked at him, the sincerity in Julian's eyes undoing him. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to be. Enough. Julian took his face in his hands, his touch gentle but unyielding. You are enough. You're more than enough. And I'm not letting you run from this. The words broke something in Mateo, a wall he'd built long ago. He kissed Julian, desperate and raw, pouring everything he couldn't say into the moment. The world faded the music, the laughter, the weight of Liam's gaze. For now, it was just them, two men fighting for something real. But the night wasn't over. As they returned to the reception, Mateo caught sight of Liam watching them from across the room, his expression unreadable. A chill ran through him. This wasn't the end of their story, it was just the beginning of something bigger, something neither of them could predict. The reception buzzed with life, but Mateo felt like he was underwater. Sounds muffled. Every glance from Liam a ripple in his calm. Julian stayed close, his presence a tether, but the weight of their secret pressed harder now. Mateo wanted to lose himself in the music, in Julian's laughter, but Liam's knowing look lingered like a bruise. They danced again, Julian's hands steady on Mateo's waist, but Mateo's eyes kept drifting to Liam, who was now laughing with Ellie, his arm around her like nothing had ever happened. Mateo envied that ease, the ability to move on, to bury the past. He'd never been good at that. His past was inked into his skin, carved into his bones. You're doing it again, Julian said, pulling him closer. Getting lost in your head. Mateo forced a smile. Can't help it. This whole thing. It's a lot. Julian's expression softened, but there was a flicker of frustration in his eyes. I know. But we're here. Together. Can you try to focus on that? Mateo nodded, but the words felt like a challenge he wasn't sure he could meet. He wanted to be the man Julian deserved, open, steady, unafraid, but the ghost of his hookup with Liam haunted him, a reminder of who he'd been before Julian. A man who didn't believe in love, only escape. As the night wore on, Julian got pulled into a family photo, leaving Mateo alone at their table. He sipped his drink, scanning the crowd. When Liam approached, his tie loosened, his smile polite but guarded. Mind if I sit? Liam asked, not waiting for an answer. Mateo tensed, his grip tightening on his glass. What do you want? Liam leaned back, his eyes steady. To clear the air? That night. It was nothing, right? Just a moment. Mateo's jaw clenched. Yeah. Nothing. Liam nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. You're with Julian now. He's a good guy. Don't hurt him. The words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they echoed Mateo's own fears. I'm not trying to, he said, his voice low. But you're not exactly in a position to give advice. Liam's smile faded. Fair. I love Ellie. That night was a mistake. Before I met her. I don't want it to ruin anything for her. Or for Julian. Mateo wanted to hate him, but Liam's honesty disarmed him. It won't, he said, hoping it was true. Not if we both keep it in the past. Liam nodded, standing. Deal. He hesitated, then added, Julian's lucky. You seem like you care. Mateo didn't respond, watching Liam walk away, his words a mix of relief and warning. He cared about Julian more than he'd ever cared about anyone, but caring wasn't enough. He had to prove it, to himself and to Julian. When Julian returned, his smile was bright, oblivious to the conversation. Miss me? He teased, sliding into the chair beside Mateo. Always, Mateo said, the words slipping out with more truth than he intended. Julian's eyes softened, and he leaned in, kissing Mateo softly, a promise in the touch. The rest of the night passed in a haze of laughter and music, but Mateo couldn't fully relax. He kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Liam to slip, for Julian to pull away. But Julian stayed, his hand in Mateo's, his laughter a lifeline. When the reception ended, they drove back to the city in silence, the weight of the day settling between them. In Mateo's apartment, Julian kicked off his shoes, his suit jacket draped over a chair. Today was intense, he said, his voice soft. But I'm glad you were there. Mateo sat on the edge of the bed, his hands restless. I almost wasn't. I don't do well with stuff like this. Families, weddings, all of it. Julian sat beside him, his shoulder brushing Mateo's. I know. But you showed up. That matters. Mateo looked at him, the vulnerability in Julian's eyes undoing him. I don't want to mess this up, he admitted. But I'm scared I will. My past. It's always there. Julian. Julian took his hand, his grip firm. Your past doesn't scare me. It's part of you, and I want all of you. The words broke something in Mateo, a dam he'd built to keep himself safe. He pulled Julian close, kissing him with a desperation that felt like surrender. They fell into bed, not with the urgency of their first night, but with a tenderness that scared Mateo more. This wasn't just a hookup, Anna Marie, it was real, and that made it dangerous. The next morning, Julian woke early, sketching at the kitchen table while Mateo slept. He drew Mateo's face, capturing the sharp lines of his jaw, the vulnerability in his sleep. Julian knew he was falling in love, and it terrified him. He'd been hurt before, left by someone who couldn't commit. But Mateo was different, broken. Yes, but trying, and that effort meant everything. When Mateo woke, he found Julian's sketch, his own face staring back at him, softened by Julian's lines. You make me look better than I am, he said, his voice rough with sleep. Julian smiled, setting down his pencil. I draw what I see. They spent the day together, wandering the city, talking about nothing and everything. But the wedding lingered, a shadow they couldn't fully shake. Mateo knew he had to face his past, not just with Liam, but with himself. He couldn't keep running from who he'd been if he wanted to be the man Julian deserved. That night, as they lay in bed, Julian's head on his chest, Mateo made a silent promise. He'd fight for this, for them, no matter how hard it got. But deep down, he knew the hardest battles were still ahead. The weeks after the wedding were a delicate dance. Mateo and Julian fell into a rhythm, nights at Mateo's studio, mornings at Julian's apartment, shared coffees and quiet moments that felt like promises. But the shadow of Liam lingered, a silent question neither fully addressed. Mateo wanted to believe they'd moved past it, but Julian's occasional silences told him otherwise. Mateo threw himself into his work, his tattoo gun a steady hum as he etched stories on his skin. Each client was a distraction, a way to quiet the voice in his head that said he wasn't enough. Julian came by the shop sometimes, sketching in the corner, his presence a warmth Mateo didn't know he'd craved. They'd talk for hours, Julian's dreams of an art gallery clashing with Mateo's pragmatism, but the differences only pulled them closer. One evening, Julian brought up the idea of moving in together. They were at a diner, neon lights buzzing overhead, burgers half-eaten between them. We're practically living together already, Julian said, his tone casual but his eyes serious. Why not make it official? Mateo froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The idea thrilled and terrified him. He'd never shared his space, never let anyone that close. I don't know, he said, his voice tight. That's big. Julian's smile faltered, but he nodded. Yeah, just a thought. The conversation hung over them, unspoken but heavy. Mateo wanted to say yes, to leap into this life Julian offered, but fear held him back. What if he failed? What if his past, his hookups, his scars, his inability to trust ruined them? A few days later, Julian got a call from Ellie. She was back from her honeymoon, glowing with stories of Italy, but there was a strain in her voice. Can you come over? She asked. I need to talk. Julian invited Mateo, sensing he needed to be there. They arrived at Ellie and Liam's new apartment, a cozy place filled with wedding gifts and unpacked boxes. Ellie greeted them warmly, but her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. Liam was in the kitchen, his smile tight when he saw Mateo. Over coffee, Ellie's composure cracked. I found something, she said, her voice trembling. On Liam's phone. Messages from someone. From before we met. Julian's heart sank, his eyes flicking to Mateo. Mateo's stomach twisted, but he stayed silent, waiting. Ellie didn't know about him, and Liam she couldn't, but the coincidence felt like a trap. It's not what you think, Liam said quickly, his voice steady but strained. It was a one-time thing. Ellie, before I even knew you. I swear. Ellie's eyes filled with tears. Why didn't you tell me? I thought we were honest with each other. Julian reached for her hand, his own heart racing. Ellie, whatever happened, you two can work through it. You love each other. Mateo stayed quiet, his guilt a weight he couldn't shake. He wanted to confess, to clear the air, but the words wouldn't come. Liam's eyes met his, a silent plea to stay silent, and Mateo hated how complicit it made him feel. They left the apartment with promises to check in, but the drive back was tense. Julian stared out the window, his jaw tight. You think it was you? He asked finally, his voice low. Mateo gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. I don't know. Could be. But I didn't send him any messages. It was one night. Julian, I told you everything. Julian nodded, but the doubt in his eyes was a knife. I want to believe you. I do. But this. It's messing with my head. Mateo pulled over, the city lights blurring through the windshield. I'm not that guy anymore, he said, his voice raw. I don't want to be. I want you. Julian. Just you. Julian looked at him, his expression torn. I want you too. But I need to know we're on the same page. No more secrets. Mateo nodded, his throat tight. No more secrets. They drove back to Mateo's, the silence heavy but not broken. That night, they held each other closer, as if touch could mend the cracks. But Mateo knew the truth. Trust was fragile, and they were still learning how to hold it. The next day, Julian went to see Ellie alone, needing to support her without the weight of Mateo's presence. Ellie was calmer, but the hurt lingered. I love him, she told Julian. But I hate that he kept this from me. Julian nodded, his own heart aching. Love's messy, he said. But it's worth it if you both fight for it. When he got back to Mateo's, he found him sketching a portrait of Julian that captured every detail: his curls, his eyes, the way he smiled when he thought no one was looking. You're too good at this, Julian said, his voice soft. Mateo set down his pencil, his eyes meeting Julian's. I'm trying to be good at us, too. Julian smiled, the tension easing. You're getting there. They spent the evening talking, not about Liam or Ellie, but about their future dreams of a shared apartment. Maybe a dog. Maybe a life neither had dared to imagine before. For the first time, Mateo let himself believe it was possible. But the shadow of the past wasn't gone, and he knew they'd have to face it eventually. Months passed, and the rhythm of Matteo and Julian's life together grew steadier. They didn't move in together not yet, but Julian's toothbrush stayed at Matteo's, and Matteo's sketches filled Julian's apartment. They were building something, piece by piece, learning to trust despite the cracks in their foundation. Liam and Ellie's marriage held, their love weathering the storm of secrets. But Matteo and Julian kept their own truth buried, a silent pact to protect everyone. One spring evening, Julian got a call from a gallery in the Mission. They'd seen his work online, wanted to feature him in a group show. His excitement was electric, his eyes bright as he told Matteo over dinner. "This could be it," he said, his hands animated. "A real shot at my own gallery someday." Matteo grinned, pride swelling in his chest. "You're gonna kill it. They're lucky to have you." Julian leaned across the table, kissing him softly. "You're coming to the opening, right?" "Wouldn't miss it," Matteo said, meaning it. He'd never been one for art galleries. But for Julian, he'd show up anywhere. The night of the gallery opening, the space was alive with color and chatter, Julian's vibrant cityscapes glowing under soft lights. Matteo stood by one of his pieces, a painting of the Castro at dusk, rainbow flags vivid against the twilight. He saw himself in it, a shadow in the crowd, and felt a pang of awe at how Julian saw the world, how he saw him. Julian was in his element, charming collectors and critics, his smile brighter than the gallery lights. But halfway through the night, Liam and Ellie arrived, their presence a jolt Matteo hadn't expected. Ellie hugged Julian, her pride evident, but Liam's eyes found Matteo's, a flicker of unease passing between them. "Congrats, Jules," Liam said, his tone warm but careful. "This is incredible." Julian beamed, oblivious to the tension. "Thanks for coming. Means a lot." Matteo stayed quiet, his hand in Julian's, grounding himself. He wanted to believe the past was buried, but Liam's presence was a reminder it never truly was. As the night went on, Matteo stepped outside for air. The galleries hummed too much. Liam followed, his steps hesitant. "We good?" Liam asked, his voice low. Matteo nodded, his jaw tight. "As long as you're good to Ellie." Liam's expression softened. "I am. I love her. You don't have to worry." "I'm not," Matteo said, sharper than he meant. "I'm worried about Julian." Liam nodded, understanding. "He's happy with you. Don't mess that up." The words echoed Matteo's own fears. But before he could respond, Julian appeared, his eyes searching. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Matteo said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just catching up." Liam excused himself, and Julian looked at Matteo, his brow furrowed. "You sure you're okay?" Matteo pulled him close, kissing his forehead. "I'm sure. Let's go back in. This is your night." The gallery show was a success, Julian's work selling out by the end of the night. They celebrated with cheap wine and late-night tacos, Julian's laughter filling Matteo's studio. But as they lay in bed, Julian's head on his chest, Matteo felt the weight of everything they hadn't said. "I love you," Julian whispered, the words soft but seismic. Matteo's breath caught, his heart pounding. He'd never said those words, never thought he could. But with Julian, they felt right, inevitable. "I love you too," he said, his voice raw. Julian's smile was radiant, and they kissed, the world falling away. For the first time, Matteo believed he could be enough not just for Julian, but for himself. Months later, they stood in a new apartment, boxes scattered, walls bare but full of promise. They'd signed the lease together, a leap neither had been sure they could take. Julian hung one of his paintings, the Castro at dusk, while Matteo unpacked dishes, their laughter mingling with the city's hum outside. The past wasn't gone, Liam. The hookup, The secret still lingered, but it no longer defined them. Mateo had learned to fight, not just for survival, but for love, for a future he'd never dared to dream of. And as he watched Julian, his partner, his home, he knew he'd keep fighting. Every day? For this. Their story wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, messy, real, and worth every scar.